what the soul brings back to Earth that is innate within after a sojourn in Mars. Innate means certain vibrations have become ingrained in the soul and can be accessed and felt by the physical body through the emotions. In Mars we find that tendency at times to become easily erratic, easily ruffled. The influence in Mars we find making for anger and again a temperament, yet bringing into the forces those things where anger, wrath, war, turmoils, strifes among groups and individuals have made for sudden changes in the activities of the entity and its relationships to the material life. From Mars also we find a benevolent influence, so that in the entity's experience, it may be found that oft upon the activities of others in disputes, in wrath, in anger, there may come from the entity's own attitude as to its mental influences, conditions and experiences, even in the material world, that are beneficent influences in the entity's activity. From the experiences in Mars we find that inclination which has been indicated for the activities that make for the headstrongness and activities in that direction. Also we find those influences in Mars that make for easy to anger, and this unless curbed within the experience of the entity, may bring those influences, those forces as will make for detrimental force. Anger is worthy. But anger uncontrolled is productive of the basis of those things that bring destruction in the experience of self and the purposes for which and to which the entity may lend self. One slow to wrath, yet one who holds grudge when once aroused. Hence one who keeps the forces of wrath dominant in self when aroused. One who has much of the mental abilities to weigh the conditions of life and of the surrounding forces in Earth's plane, and with the will's force, may put aside much of those elements as found in the Martian conditions. In Mars we find the adverse influence, where anger, discussion or the like at times brings those attitudes desired to be eliminated. These may best be eliminated through the cultivation of that consciousness or awareness of the abiding of peace within self. For peace and harmony as the entity experiences, not as all others, but as the entity experiences, is a matter of being able to hold within self the awareness of the promises of life and light as expressed in him. Those influences in Mars make for that quick temper at times that arises. While self has controlled and does control self in these directions most of the time, the activities in the mental and the spiritual should make for the developing of the abilities in self mentally that, though anger may arise in the experience with the associations of things and individuals, there is the ability to use rather than be used by such conditions, which will make for the stronger character building in the entity. Those in Mars make for periods where even in the present sojourn there have been differences, or where anger and misunderstanding have made for changes in the environs, changing in the attitude and in the position or conditions from the material angle. Mars, as related to material things. Hence there have been in the experience some very disturbing forces in the activities of those associated with the entity in their relationships to madness, anger, satisfying of personal appetites, aggrandizement of interests, and these have been problems for the entity. In Mars we find those inclinations for differences of opinions, as well as for the purposes or desires to be magnified, rather than seeking that common level upon which cooperation may be had with others. This should be rather the inclination. Also Mars makes for this great influence as has been indicated of orderliness, neatness, and those things that pertain to the bringing of experiences as to everything being under command or law and order. And too oft the temptation is for the entity to be the law and the order also. In Mars, we find those tendencies oft for the entity to become rather in the manner of too easily misdirected by considered slights or little differences that arise between associates or individuals. Or there are tendencies for what in others would be wrath to the entity closes the activities of the entity rather than to argue the question with anyone, accepting a slight and misunderstanding rather than to be too antagonistic. This is well, if not carried too far, but is easily made to become a detriment to the better interests of the entity in its mental, in its physical, in its soul relations. In the astrological aspects, these have been rather as hindrances, especially in those of Mars, where madness or wrath at times has and does wield an influence, such as the entity would oft within self feel like, to put in common parlance, kicking over the traces, yet the activities of self within that as would be accomplished, will the entity take counsel and self for a moment, enter, as it were, within, and counsel with those forces that arise from the purposefulness, these show their fruits in the activities of the entity's undertakings. We find those influences from Mars making radical activities that have been about the entity, bringing the entity in contact with those forces or influences where anger, wrath, has made for disturbing forces. These may, if the entity allows same, become part of the experience. But if that balance is held which is innate within self, these may be used as stepping stones rather than stumbling stones as they have in some of the experiences in the present. Afflictions we find in Mars. Hence more and more must the entity not only within itself but within the application of say more in its dealings with others, not allow wrath or resentment, or even too great anxieties, to influence the better judgments of the entity, and that it has and does set as its ideal, whether this be from the physical, mental or the spiritual phases of the entity's endeavors. We find in Mars that the consciousness of continuity is more than ordinarily active in whatever phase of awareness is being interpreted by the entity in its analysis of self. Thus we find an unusual character, and one of which it is only reminded, that while these may be in the purposes to analyze self, others, the personal and practical application is made in relationships to activities, else these will all come to naught. Through Mars we find those influences that may be considered as indiscretions of others, as well as madness and war, have brought many changes and many influences in the experience of the entity in the present, making not merely for habit-forming conditions, but experiences that have changed the course of events, changed the course of habits, changed the course of relationships of the entity in the experience. Or, as has been indicated, circumstances through the influence have arisen. The choice has been made by the entity to allow same to make the change. These then make for an entity that has a high sense of the correctness of relationships. One that has dealings with and will have influences that become far-reaching to groups and masses of individuals. One of a high nervous temperament at times, and at times apparently very set, very demanding or commanding as well as demanding in its relationships and directions. And yet very sentimental when we come to the basic influences in the experience. One that is easy to anger, yet has as it were been easy to make for restitutions in those respects where there has been the convincing of the error in the way. As from the Mars influence, oft there has been allowed anger and madness to control in the experience in varied directions. When ye should have been just at times ye have allowed others to overstep, because as thine excuse, or thy justification, ye didn't want to fuss, and yet ye have made a fuss or a racket, and been the very cause of much of turmoil in the lives of many. Why? Gratifying thine own self, without the thought of that I must meet this in my associations with others day by day. The inclinations from the Martian influences are for anger to easily arise in the experiences when the entity is fraught in its activities, in the associations, in its determinations. And it usually has its way, unless there is reason and love and care and precaution shown by those that direct the developing or formative periods. Mars has made for those forces where anger, wrath and the like have become such at times that the necessity of choice became paramount to be weighed with those innate feelings that all of such experiences are worthy of being considered and not thrown aside lightly, neither are they to be dwelt upon in such measures or manners as to become paramount. For the creating of anger breeds contempt. Contempt gone to fruition breeds strife and makes for disturbing forces that become, in the experiences of the entity, those things that bring inharmony. Madness and anger from Mars have deprived the entity of opportunities, or have offered opportunities, will offer opportunities. And what the entity does about those influences makes or mars the experiences as in relation to same. Use hindrances then ever as stepping stones and not as rafts that would drag thee from thy purpose or from thy ideal. We find in Mars those influences forming the basis of the conditions that bring about changes, as in wrath, determination to have an individual way or to have a way of the own, disregarding at times the consequences even to self or others. These become a part of the entity's experience innately. Madness and anger from Mars have deprived the entity of opportunities, or have offered opportunities, will offer opportunities. And what the entity does about those influences makes or mars the experiences as in relation to same. Use hindrances then ever as stepping stones and not as rafts that would drag thee from thy purpose or from thy ideal. In Mars, we find there are times when in the extremes, whether in the emotions mental or physical, these have brought experiences where anger has taken or may take hold in such ways or manners as to become a detrimental influence. In those influences from Mars, we will find that anger at times in the activities of others about the entity may bring some distressing disturbances. These are those things in which the entity may become sullen, morose, or in the mulligrubs as it might be termed by some. These are only disturbances within self. And when these arise, know that thy relationships with the creative forces within are looking for self-indulgence and self-glory, rather than for the influences that are thy life itself. And the urge through Mars forces brings that at times of the temper that has been subdued in part through that of self's will to apply that of love and forbearance, rather than that as would appear in the urge to enact at that time. Just as in the adverse forces of Mars, anger, wrath, war and things as would make the preparations of same offer not only excuses, but oft justifications for the rashness as may have been, as may become a part of the experience of the entity in its relationships with individuals, in its activity with those not only of its own kind or kindred, but in the marital associations also. In Mars we find anger, animosity, covetousness becoming the influencer force for detrimental activity in the experience. But being forewarned and applying that which has been and may be given in the experience, as has been and will be a part of the entity may so pattern its policies, its activities with its fellow men, as to make such experiences stepping stones, rather than stumbling stones in its advancement and its development for its purposes and ideals through this material sojourn. And the influence as seen from Mars brings those that in a manner the entity has conquered or at least delayed within self, of wrath, contempt, and of littleness. These have been innate from experiences and the entity must war, as it were, against such. For we will find from Mars not only those inclinations for anger, madness, ire to arise, but also the inclination for the inventiveness, the daringness, as will be seen from the experiences of the entity in the earthly sojourns and other fields of activity. In the astrological, as has been indicated, that has been altered in the present experience through that of Mars has brought much discontent, much association that was forced upon the entity in experiences of relationships and conditions that has been hurt to the inner being, yet having accomplished in self, meeting that influences has been builded, will the entity apply self in the spiritual welfare, especially as relates to facts and figures particularly. Will there be brought to the entity in the next few years, a contentment that has not been experienced only in short periods in this sojourn. We find from Mars that the entity has a very good temper. This isn't bad temper, but a good temper. One without a temper is in very bad shape, but one who can't control his temper is in still worse shape. The entity is one, then, who has learned to hold the temper and yet not be entirely suppressed in doing so or by the needs of such, rather being able to gain from same, through the very virtue of patience and long-suffering, which has been and is the experience of the entity through this particular sojourn. In Mars, as seen, even the beauty of strength is to the entity a thing to be proud of, yet those influences as deal with same in an unholy way become abhorrent to the entity, yet in such force, such powers, and in the activities of same, have the changes been wrought in the experiences of the entity, both as to the entity's inner experience, as well as changes in material ways and manners. From Mars we find the associations with things where conditions of war, of anger, of wrath on the part of the individuals, groups or masses, do bring and have had, and will have great influences upon the activities of the entity. They that have no temper are worth little. They that have not a control of their temper are worth less. Hence as the entity applies self, there needs to be the cultivation of those inclinations to become domineering. As the entity is a leader or director, then train self to work with, never for, nor have others work for you. Work with others in applying self in whatever field of activity or service is chosen. These then are the astrological forces that we find are rather unusual. Mars is rather not an adverse influence, not benevolent, but the mystery force or influence in the experiences of the entity. For Mars represents and is the influence that makes for urges within the innate forces of anger, madness, wrath, strength, endurance. And these then in their more benevolent or expressive ways have brought, will bring, the interesting experiences, provided these are looked upon rather as stepping stones and helpful experiences than those that make for the shortcomings. Hindrances should not create in the experience of the entity, then, the expressions from self of indifference or of grudges or of hate, for these are of those influences and forces that wreck, ruin, and bring dissension and strife, and those things that make the heart of men afraid. Those influences in Mars we find making for rather that which is in opposition to most of those from the Martian experience. For the entity's sojourn there was learned well. Hence those influences of anger, those influences of distress and turmoils in the associations of others, well they will oft appear upon the horizon of the entity's experience, from the very influence of those things given, the entity may oft be in all of its relationships as one whose very presence, if used in the manner indicated, will be as oil upon troubled waters. Thus the conditions that arise from such are as gladsome experiences, if the entity will not allow same to become a part of self, but knowing that the ideals as are said in self make for as to whether these become stumbling blocks or stepping stones for greater knowledge and understanding, and greater experience. In Mars we find at times anger, or not just having what's wanted at the moment upsets the entity. Curb this. Know that all comes to him who puts his trust in the all-powerful influence of love and harmony, the real poem of life, and then works like thunder for same. We find in Mars the hard-headedness that at times appears. Not that the entity is not capable of being angry, yet controls that emotion oft, yet determination and decision is manifested in the latent forces of the entity's manner of judgment, thinking and choice.